Hello everybody, welcome to this week's update video. My name is Martin and I'm an Inkscape developer and I develop features and fixes for everyday Inkscape users. But this week we are not going to talk about Inkscape, we're going to talk about its competition. So the past week or so there have been numerous announcements from the kinds of software that Inkscape tends to be compared against. The reason why I am delicate to use these kinds of words is because free software projects don't really compete against proprietary tools in the way that most people think. There isn't a marketplace where you buy Inkscape or buy, in this case, Affinity Designer or Adobe Illustrator. This is not quite how open source projects work, but it is the way in which a lot of people see products, and so the comparisons are natural. But it is interesting to see some of the things that are happening that in the proprietary space, what is actually happening in, should we say, like the vector design industry. So let's start off with the sort of easier one, which is the Adobe Illustrator features and basically they've added a bunch of extra stuff to Adobe Illustrator. These are interesting, and what was most interesting to me was seeing some of the examples people were creating online. There's some good videos out there that show off some of what they've been doing. I'm most interested in their non-AI related functionality. So there's a new perceptual gradient interpolator option, which is particularly interesting. What caught my eye though was that it has particular restrictions which don't make very much sense if you understand what it's actually doing behind the scenes. So for those of you who are not au fait with like how gradient interpolation works, basically you have two colors and you get to decide what color space those colors are in before you interpolate or choose the colors that go in between those two primary colors that you've chosen, right? If you interpolate using red, green, blue, then the channels that you walk over will have a particular kind of, should we say muddy or like gray appearance in some instances as those channels interact with each other. But RGB is not the only interpolation space that you can choose. You could actually choose to interpolate in CMYK. You can choose to interpolate in HSV. You can choose to interpolate, which is what they've done in Adobe Illustrator. They've chosen to interpolate in OkLab. OkLab is a particularly useful color space to interpolate in because you can essentially have a more representative color range which is what the eye tends to like to see. What is interesting about the Adobe Illustrator expression of this functionality is that they haven't chosen to give users the option to choose what color space to do their interpolation in. Instead, they've just kind of have a drop down with two options, one which is what looks like RGB and the other one which is OkLab, except they don't call it OkLab, they call it perceptual, which is also strange. Like it's not teaching users about like what they're actually doing. It's just kind of creating a mask, a shell, which I know a lot of user interface designers like. They like to abstract away the complexity of certain choices that users might have to make. But I also like the pedagogical approach, which is where the user interface should be as easy as possible, but also as educational as possible. I.e. the user interface's job is not just to help the user make things, but also it should attempt to educate the user in how the tools that they are using actually operate. Because the more understanding you have, the more flexibility you have in your mental mapping of like what software is capable of. And also you'll be able to see the inconsistencies more apparently when the software fails, in this particular case, to offer you those extra options. There's also some strange things going on when it comes to exporting those perceptual gradients to other things, PDF particularly, which is kind of interesting because you can actually interpolate in other color spaces in PDF. All you need to do is make sure that you have an ICC profile in that space. And I'm guessing it's just too hard to make an OkLab ICC profile, or maybe it's just too hard to make a gradient function that works for this particular case. Or they just didn't have time to make it. Maybe they'll fix it later. But at the moment, they're rasterizing, which is not a great solution for this particular feature. There are other ways that you can actually cope with this, creating, for instance, multiple gradient stops in between whenever the range in RGB falls outside of its a perceptual gradient. So like there are other mathematical models that you could use, but they chose a very simple one where they just rasterize things. C'est la vie, whatever their developers are up to, I guess. Okay, so that's the Adobe Illustrator stuff. They're adding a bunch of features, but I see no real change in what Adobe Illustrator is doing functionally for its users in terms of their pricing models or their AI offering. It's just more of the same, it looks like. Okay. Let's move on to a much more interesting case, which is the Affinity Designer announcement. What they're basically doing is they're making Affinity free for everybody, so no cost. And they are, if you want the AI features, then you have to pay. This is a fairly shrewd option for Canva. Basically what they're saying is, from my perspective in the free and open source world, it's a kind of rearguard action against the possibility of tools like Krita, GIMP, and Inkscape essentially eating Affinity's lunch, right? They don't want a situation where the open source tools take over. That would be very bad. So this is very smart in terms of cutting off, should we say, like the users of these tools that don't really care about free software. They don't care about freedom. They care about it being available at no cost. And this is where, when you know how I started this video about how free and open source projects don't really compete in the same marketplace. This is where we get into a really interesting dynamic where we'll probably lose users to Affinity Designer in this particular case, but those users tend not to be the ones that contribute to the project itself, right? They tend not to be the ones who would pay for Inkscape if we offered it for a price, and they tend not to be the ones who would contribute code or their time or make donations. And that's because the key value proposition in most open source projects is that of ownership, right? Control. You get to actually own the tool, not just have access to it. So it's not just about being free to access it because it doesn't cost any money. It's actually about this thing where people can't take it away from you. They can't change it in ways that stop you from being able to do your work. They can't, like for instance, we would never be able to abide by a US government sanction that stopped a country, let's say Venezuela, from being able to access Inkscape. We just can't do it. There's no control mechanism for us to pull. Even if we were forced to by law, we wouldn't be able to do it. So the question that I have to ask is, for those users who want to use Affinity Designer, is can you make sure that like you're not being pushed into a direction where you end up without that control? Because like I understand that a lot of users don't really value their ownership over the tools in the same way that we do in the free software world, but perhaps I would counsel that just make sure that you can continue to use your tools, especially if you're an artist that earns your money through your art. Make sure that you can use the tools without being logged in, without requiring a user account, right? Actively. You can have an account to download it or whatever, but like having to be online in order to use the tool is a real problem, because it can be taken away from you at any time. And make sure that like the downloaded version doesn't like auto update or do any other weird things that may end up with you not being able to continue to use the tools as they currently are. So like even if you're getting it for free, there are mechanisms of control that could be pushed upon you later on, if you don't take precautions and make sure that like data is in an open format where possible, where you are making sure that your projects are not overly dependent upon a thing that could be taken away at any time, and making sure that there's no avenues for your data to be abused, like being used for AI training, or just generally stolen, because that's never a good idea. But overall, from Inkscape's perspective, having access to more tools is good. There's no shame in using the tools that you need to use, and to make sure that you can have a breadth of tools that you have in your arsenal to be able to make the best artwork. That's always a good idea. And I would say that especially if your paid work requires you to have a level of professionalism that's not available yet in Inkscape, it's not going to hurt me to hear that people are using Affinity Designer now that it's available for free. Okay, so I probably gabbled on a lot. I hope this kind of makes sense. I haven't scripted this, so and I know I tend to talk on a little bit more about the politics side of stuff because it is the kind of thing that I'm interested in, and I think it is the thing that is the most difficult to explain to users, as opposed to like just buying things off a shelf and seeing a price. That's a very easy comparison to make. But when it comes to open source, I'm hoping that we can continue to serve our users. And I want to thank the people who continue to sponsor my work, obviously. The work on the CMYK stuff continues apace. And I will see you all hopefully next week.